Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Jason Silverman. Thank you for joining this BlazeMeter webinar, Load Testing for Your Black Friday, which we will talk about large-scale load test ahead of Black Friday, Cyber Monday, or any peak traffic event. We will get started in about a minute. I know there's some people who are still arriving. But while we are waiting, I'll actually make a few announcements. And then I'll turn things over to our presenter, Dave Caro. One of which is today's webinar is being recorded, and we will send the copy of the recording via email to all those who registered, hopefully by tomorrow, if not by the end of this week. It's usually within a couple of days. So keep an eye out for that in your email. Secondly, our webinars are always better with questions from the audience, and the way you can ask questions is in the webinar control panel in the questions tab. We will reserve time to answer questions at the end of today's webinar. What I do always say is, firstly, we get a lot of questions, so please try to keep the question on topic of today's webinar as much as possible. Like today's webinar won't be about Selenium or be a deep dive into JMeter, which some of our other webinars are. So just try to keep it on the topic of what the webinar will be. Also, I can't promise we will get to every single question, but we try to get to as many as possible. And we do see the questions afterwards in the webinar system, so we will also try to respond via email if we don't get a chance to address it during the live broadcast. Final announcement for now. Dave, are you ready to go once I finish with the final announcement?
Super close, probably another minute. Okay. I'm good to go.
Sure. So we will have a survey that will pop up at the end of today's webinar. The survey, we do encourage you to fill out. It's a few things I can tell you about it. Firstly, it just takes about 30 seconds to fill out. It really will not take you much time at all. We do appreciate it for a few different reasons. Firstly, it will allow us to get your feedback about how we did today and how we can improve these type of webinars in the future, which we do very much look at the survey. It's one of the first things we do after the webinar, a few minutes afterwards. So please, let us know what you think. Secondly, it will allow you the opportunity to request a follow-up demo either for yourself or for the members of your team to address your specific testing needs. I know the webinars that we present are, we're presenting to a wide audience, people around the world and at different levels, but that each people have their own specific testing needs, and we do very much offer the opportunity to give you a demo on BlazeMeter and how we can help you with your load and performance testing. So it will give you, the survey will give you an opportunity to request that as well. So, Dave, are we good?
We're good to go. Let's get into the deck here, and I will get my dashboard back actually, so I can unfreeze my screen. That's interesting, Jason. I don't see my taskbar, which is really crazy. Here it is. All right, now we're good to go. Let's get this party started. You can see my screen okay? See me moving my mouse around a little bit?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Dave Caro, and I'm really glad to be joining you here. I'm going to talk today about load testing for your Black Friday. The reason why I call it your Black Friday is that we're really talking about getting ready for any kind of peak traffic. Obviously, the most well-known one in the U.S. is Black Friday and Cyber Monday, where some businesses do, 30 or even 60% of their annual volume in just a few days. But the idea, it's not exclusive to e-commerce. If you have some kind of a thing that's coming along that's going to lead to a spike in activity and probably like a really high value customer experience, you're in the right place. I'll give you an example that's completely different than e-commerce. In the U.S., we call open enrollment for healthcare. It takes place typically sort of 1 month near the end of the year, maybe October, November, and suddenly 20,000 employees may all need to be able to go up there and choose their doctor, and that's another example of a kind of a peak period, right? So let's jump in. I'm gonna and just to, in fact, I'll go back here for a second. A little background on me. I've been in load testing for quite a while, and an early part of my career, pretty much exclusively focused on outside-in testing late in the game for very, very large e-commerce companies. And I've been kind of shifting to the left, where I've been moving more towards helping developers be ready before they ever get anywhere near shipping their code. And what I want to share today is kind of a mix of I think that no matter whether you're technical or non-technical, whether you're trying to make sure your team's doing the right thing, or whether you're the practitioner that's going to go in and do all the details, what I want to do today is make sure you have both the high-level sort of design principles, where how do I really do great peak traffic preparation, and then some technical tips in the middle, and some nitty-gritty as well. There should be something for everybody. So let's dive right in and get into it. The first thing is it's really never too early to start preparing for peak traffic. And sometimes you get the question, well, so hey, when do e-commerce companies start preparing for this, or the big rush of business that comes in November and in December? And some people are pretty surprised to hear that that can happen literally starting in February. I was working a couple jobs ago. We did a webinar with Home Depot, and their team gets through the Black Friday, takes about a month off, does a little post-mortem, and in February they actively start their planning and preparation for the next year's Black Friday, right? There is another kind of wave of companies that get started in sort of March and April and May, and then there's companies that sort of like to live dangerously and try to figure things out in September. But realistically, it's never too early to start preparing for peak traffic. There's a corollary, though, which is at the very, very least, leave some time for fixes. One of the big sort of problems with load testing is sometimes people think it's the thing they do at the end just to confirm they're ready. You know, let's just confirm we're ready, we'll do a load test. Well, obviously there's the possibility that you're not going to be ready, and you're going to find some problems, you're going to need to fix them. You want to leave time for some iterations. You want to leave some time to be able to look into stuff that could be better. You want to leave time to fix things that are very broken. So you need to start testing. Don't count back in days from when you're going live, and if you're going to do that, then count back at least 90. Give yourself some room to actually make fixes, right? So before we get into kind of the details, let's talk about the cost of not doing it right, or kind of not doing this at all, which is, if you have an opportunity when peak traffic comes along, there's an opportunity on several levels. And if you're unable to meet the demand, then there's clearly going to be a direct loss of revenue or customers on that day when you're hoping to get all this extra business and you aren't able to function. You certainly are losing revenue, right? Direct loss of money right away, right? You're also losing reputation. So when people come to your site and it's slow or broken, it damages your reputation, and that's a longer term thing, right? And that's kind of related to the next item, which is immediate churn. So on the day when you are slow or broken, you are losing people immediately. Your goal is to get and retain customers, and when people come and the site is not working, you lose them, and you might lose them for a short period or for a long period. And fun little fact, it is there have been a couple studies done that actually say that if your site is slow, you're more likely to lose somebody long term than if your site is flat out offline. If your site is not available, people may come back and try again, but if it's really painful to use, they're probably going to consider alternatives. Now, in the terms of churn, one person's misfortune is another person's, boon. The snowball effect is what happens when one site goes down on a busy day. Let's say the busy day, it doesn't have to be shopping for the holidays. It could be ordering flowers for Mother's Day or Valentine's Day. And if one of the flower sites is down on one of those days, the other flower sites are going to see more volume, right? And so the snowball effect is a matter of actually getting, if you're fortunate enough to be up on a day when others are down, you're going to get more business. And that's generally a really good thing, unless that brings you down, right? So one reason why I bring up the snowball effect is that when you're planning for peak traffic, you obviously want to take into account what you think you're going to get in the way of traffic. It's also useful to think about what what would happen if other providers in your space were to fail and their traffic were to come your way? So you might want to have even some extra headroom in there so that you can grow beyond kind of your wildest expectations, right? So here's where we get into the stuff that I think hopefully will make a difference for you if you haven't been down this road before in terms of the hard lessons learned, is that, what makes an effective test? I wrote a white paper a while back that was called Avoiding the Dreaded Checkbox Load Test. And the idea was that, the last load test you want to do is one that you do just so you can say, we did a load test. Because if you don't build the test to accurately predict, based on accurate predictions of what's going to happen, then you don't know whether you're ready for what happens, right? And it kills me sometimes where people will literally, there's a major e-commerce provider who spent millions of dollars on a promotion to drive people to a very small list of items in their catalog. And when the big day came and they spent their millions of dollars and the people came, the site crashed for over 24 hours. And people asked, well, did you do load testing of the site? They said, oh, absolutely. As we architected this site, we did lots of load testing, but we didn't test for that scenario. Right? And you ask yourself, so marketing spent millions of dollars and the guys did some load testing, but they didn't test the scenario that marketing actually created, right? And intuitively, it sounds like a no-brainer, but you'd be amazed at how often this is the case. So we'll get to that in a second, but let's take a second to look at how do we build tests based on reality, not happy paths. And if you haven't heard the term happy path before, this is basically sort of the straightforward, predictable, easy way through a site. A user arrives at a site, they browse the catalog, they put an item in the shopping cart, they check out, they put in their details, they choose the shipping, they purchase, they're done, right? That's sort of a very simple, happy path. And the reality is in the real world, users aren't so simple and they don't just follow those simple, happy paths, and they don't always buy one item or just two items. They could spend quite a while browsing on your site. They could put a lot of stuff in the shopping cart and leave. They could, there's a lot of things they could do that in the real world are not the simple, I arrive and I do these steps. So don't think like a functional tester. When you're creating these kinds of tests, you don't want to think like I'm just exercising each piece of functionality and I'm just, you actually want to know what your users do. So where do you find that out? Well, if you're lucky enough to have been down this road with the same solution, last year or the last time you had a peak event, you go look at your analytics, right? So you may have Google Analytics, you may have Adobe Analytics, that used to be in the day called Omniture. These things keep detailed records of what do people do, how many people do what. They come to the homepage, then they do what. Some of them land on a landing page, and then they go where. So you want to get as much as you can a clear idea of what's the real statistics of who comes from where and does what. And it could include geography too, by the way. If you're serving multiple geographies, what geographies do people come from, right? So the next one on this list is application performance monitoring. And if you're fortunate to have a tool that keeps track of the health of all of your backend systems, and might even be able to keep track of individual user journeys through the systems, that's a rich source of data. And you want to know for days when you are stressed, when you are busy, where does the application tend to show strain? Where are the points that things tend to heat up? You want to know that ahead of time, and you want to, because those are the things you're going to want to watch when you're actually doing your testing. And also from that same data, you can also, again, further enrich what do people do with the system? What are the transactions that are happening, right? And then logs. So back in the day, this used to be the only way we really knew what people were doing on our websites, is that we would look at logs, whether we looked at them by hand or whether we had log file analyzers. But a log can tell you a lot of really important data, and some of the key things you want to look for there are, what is the typical arrival rate pattern? So arrival rate is sort of how do users show up in waves? So they probably don't come in a very consistent, I add one user, add one user, add one user. They probably come in kind of fits and spurts. What does that look like? What's the average time on site? How many pages does the average user see? These are things you can often get from logs if you can't get them from analytics. So the three are really technologies. They're systems that you would pull data from. The bottom three on here are people. They're humans. So let's talk about why you want to talk to these humans and what you want to find out, right? So product managers know what they're changing in the app or the storefront or whatever it is that you're putting up. They know where they're trying to have users go. They know they know what a launch is about, et cetera. So you want to find out from them, what is their sense of, now they may not be able to perfectly predict what's going to happen, but what is their story about what's supposed to happen, where people are going to go, what are the main features. So you want to know that. Customer success, if you have a customer success management function, people whose job it is to work with your largest customers, if you're in that kind of an environment, people, or even customer support if you're in more of a retail environment, what do they know about what people do? What do they know about the places where people complain when things are painful? What can you learn from those people about how people experience your site on days? And the last one is by far and away the most important one. We're talking about peak events. Well, many peak events are caused on purpose by people in marketing. They spend money on advertising and campaigns and promotions to draw traffic to your site. And there's you could make yourself a really simple list of things you want to know to start with. First of all, are they sending people to landing pages? They almost certainly are, right? They're sending people to particular places. Where are they sending them? And how are they advertising for that? Where are people going to be coming from and where are they going to land? You also want to know, are they using promotional codes? So one of these things that's one of those hard learned lessons, if you've been down there before, you'd know about it, which is that promotion codes come in two flavors. So the simple sort of a promotion code is something like save 30, which would be like, anybody who has that code saves 30% on their first order. But the other kind of promotional code is one that's unique to a user, right? It's a consumable promotional code. And those actually are programmatically very much more expensive to process, because if I come along and I've got my use once promotion code, you have to look it up. You have to know what it entitles you to. You have to mark it used when it gets used. So you have to track things through the whole transaction. There's just a lot more overhead. And so if promotional codes are going to be used, you need to know how many of them are going to be used, and you need to be able to have you used them in the past with the same solution you're using now? In a package solution where you're buying a storefront from someone, this is often the Achilles heel. If a large number of people use a promotional code in a short period of time, you can bring the database and other parts of the system to a crawl, right? So taking this whole slide in general, and by the way, we're going to go into a little more detail here on these things, but taking this whole slide in general, we want our tests to be based not on the technology of the site, not on the, the visual architecture of the menus in the app. You want to base them on human behavior, on reality, and you want to base your testing on what's most likely to happen on this day. Don't think just like a functional tester. You want to think more like a sociology researcher, perhaps. So how do I build up to the big tests, right? So the general approach is you start from small to big to huge. And the idea here is that first we need to make sure that we've got a test that works. We need to make sure that our test infrastructure is intact and doing the right thing, that our test logic is right before we ever try to scale it up, right? And then we need to figure out how to configure everything so that we get the best benefit out of our test harness and it's not one of the limitations. So at BlazeMeter, we have something called sandbox testing, which is where you run at a low volume. And for some of our more newer customers that are using the beta version of our test creation technology, we also have something called test debug test. The idea is here, how do I run my test at a low volume and pay a lot of attention to what's going on and make sure that the pieces work? If you're using JMeter and you're calling a data file, does it really call the data file? Are you cycling through the data the way expected? You could create some really simple, silly problems if you have a JMeter test that looks for a data file on your C drive or in a folder on your machine, and you upload it to BlazeMeter, for instance, and we're expecting it to be in the current directory right alongside the test. If there's a path there, you're not going to get your data, right? So sandbox testing is really about making sure that the test functions and making sure that if you've got logic in there that's sort of distributing, 1 out of every 5 users go here, whatever, that basic logic's working, right? And then we want to calibrate, and calibration is about figuring out for any given script, how heavy or light is it? And by heavy, I mean computationally intensive. Does it take a lot of memory? Does it take a lot of CPU? So after you've created your script or scripts, you need to figure out how many users can run on an individual test engine before you try to scale it up, because you don't want the test engines themselves to be melting down. That's not going to tell you anything about your application, right? So calibration testing is where you, and we'll talk about that a little bit during the demo, but calibration testing is where you figure out how to get your test harness sized correctly to deliver the right amount of load. And way back in the day, there was kind of a joke that it takes 2 mainframes to test a mainframe. Now, thanks to the cloud, we have a lot of resources available. But I literally was once in a project where we backed up 2 supercomputers to each other and had wires between them, and that's how we drove the test. You need to figure out how big of a test harness you need to drive the load so that you can test your application, right? And then we get to kind of the main event, performance testing. So now we have a series of tests that are scaling up, starting out, like let's say you want to get to 50,000 users. Your goal is to get to 50,000 users. You don't just launch a 50,000 user test on your first pass. You work your way up. Start with 500, go to 5,000, go to 10,000, because you're going to learn things along the way that you don't really need to spin up the giant test for to learn fundamental simple things. And as you do these tests that are ramping, you want them to ramp, especially at the beginning, you want them to ramp slowly. The worst thing is if you have sort of a 5-minute ramp from 0 users to 10,000, and as you're ramping like crazy, you start to see problems. Well, what load level really caused those problems? If it takes 2 or 3 minutes for a problem to kind of manifest in your system, you don't want to have blown through 10 different load levels before you ever notice there's a problem, right? So you want a longer ramp. You may need to test for spike where a lot of users arrive at once, but you want to start by actually doing a gradual ramp to discover where do you start seeing symptoms in your systems, right? So let's talk about stress testing. Stress testing, and in the world of load testing and performance testing, these words all get kind of interchanged depending on who you're talking to sometimes. But when I say stress testing, I'm talking about deliberately taking to a system to a place where you know it's going to suffer, right? So this is not validation. This is not confirmation. This is not confirming that you can get to the level you think you can get to. This is actually pushing it until you see it start to fail. And your goal here is to learn, if traffic exceeds your expectations, what breaks first, what shows the pain first, and are there ways to remediate that? But you're actually deliberately pushing it really hard to see, where does it sweat, where does it melt, where does it get hot, right? One form of stress would be to do a spike test, right, which is where you are driving load very, very quickly. If you have if you look at like reveals of products, hey, our store opens at 9 a.m. and so everybody's there at the website refreshing the homepage, waiting for the 9 a.m. open, or selling tickets, for instance, online to an event. At 9 a.m., boom, they're all coming in, and so you're going to go from like no active users to hundreds, thousands of users. So you need to do a spike test. You do that after you already have kind of done your performance testing, and then you're going to do the spike test to actually confirm A, that can you handle that spike, and B, when you have a spike, something's going to be a little bit off. Maybe some things are going to slow down, maybe some servers are going to run hot or whatever. But you want to make sure that not only can you handle the spike, but that when you back off on the spike, that your systems recover gracefully, right? Because the last thing you want to do is kind of get through the spike, get into a situation where the system is degraded, but kind of okay-ish, and then be stuck in that mode for the rest of the day, right? Because nobody wants to reboot their system during peak traffic, right? So you do a spike, and you also want to recover and see what happens, right? So capacity planning. Now, I kind of put this down here as a bit of a luxury, which is that if you get through these other steps and everything's kind of, you're meeting your needs, you're pretty sure you're going to get where you're going to go to, you might not need to go here. But capacity planning is the idea of figuring out, if you need to keep on scaling, what do you scale? If I'm going to, and by the way, this is often the case where people are just moving from traditional hosted to cloud-based, right? If you're moving from a data center to a cloud, you need to figure out, well, what's the best way to configure this, and how big does it get, and where do I need to scale? It's not automatic. The cloud doesn't just suddenly give you infinite capacity. You have to add servers, and you might have auto scaling, but you're auto scaling what? You're scaling the web servers, you're scaling the database servers, you're scaling app servers. What are you scaling, right? So capacity planning is, if you can afford it, time and resources, is to experiment with, how do I scale going various ways, and how do I get to certain targets, and kind of dress rehearsal for how do I grow. So some patterns to watch for. I'm going to show you some really oversimplified graphs in a sec. And the idea isn't that they're realistic, it's just that we are able to look at some concepts. And I want you to walk away with the patterns you're watching for in your graphs, right? So this is a very happy graph, which is the blue line is the increasing scale of users. And the yellow line is the response time. And as things are in the real world, there's a little variation in that response time. It's bouncing up and down a little bit, but it's in a fairly narrow range. And the most important thing is it doesn't change during the entire duration of the test. We've said before, we sort of refer to this as the Google search test, which is that you pretty much don't expect to cause Google search much stress. They're scaled up pretty well and they can handle what you send them, right? And no matter how many users are searching, it's probably going to be about the same. This is an ideal situation if you can deliver the same response time no matter how many users are there within the range you think you're going to see, then you're a very happy camper, right? You're more likely going to see something that looks like this, which is that at the beginning of your test, as you ramped up through this level here on the left, load was pretty consistent. So, I mean, response time for consistent. So even really 2/3 of the way up through your ramp here, you're still at a very happy response time. But then you started to see the response time climb, right? And what it's doing here, you'll notice it's actually starting to follow the slope of the rising number of users. So really you're facing saturation. Way back here, the system started to get to about its ideal capacity, and now it's falling behind a little bit. But there's really a business decision to make here. So if this line down here represents, 750 milliseconds, and this line up here represents, 1,500 milliseconds or a second and a half, these are still some pretty snappy response times. And you might be happy with this and say, you know what, it's a little less snappy, but it's acceptable, right? But if this down here is 1 to 2 seconds and this is 10 seconds up here, this is not acceptable, right? You don't really want to have users get to a really slow site on your busy day, right? So you have to decide based on what these numbers are and what your business goals are and what you think your user's sensitivity to response time is in terms of when they abandon. By the way, this is where you get back to the analytics to decide what to do here. The next one is a little different, which is in this case, as we ramp, this is what's, by the way, more likely to happen. If response time continues to climb and follow the users, at some point you're probably going to start getting errors. And whether those errors are simple just connections refused or whether they're errors in your application, this is where you can't really go. You don't really want to plan for your big day to have some significant number of users getting errors. Think about your own behavior. If you went to a site and you're getting errors, if you really wanted to buy tickets to a concert or something, you might just keep trying. But if you're shopping for flowers for Mother's Day and you get some strange errors, I don't know about you, but I'd probably look for another website to buy the flowers from, right? So in this case, you've got to fix it. So that's just some simple patterns we wanted to look at, right? So here again, we talked earlier about how do I build, meaningful tests instead of happy path tests. Let's talk about how you test smart instead of just big, right? So, and this is the part where I joke about keeping notes. We're going to send you a recording of this, so you don't really have to keep notes, but this is the stuff where you really want to make sure that you're not thinking, I'm just looking for the technical tips. I don't want to focus on this. Well, trust me, this is where you'll make or break your reputation as a good tester for peak periods, right? The very first bullet, construct realistic funnels, has been the downfall of many a person who knew how to use their tools but didn't know what to test, which is in e-commerce, especially when you have a flow, and I'll show a flow in a second, a funnel, but think about it. If you have a website where people come and everybody arrives, of course, by definition, some people browse, some people search, some people put something in a shopping cart, some people go to checkout, some people see the shipping costs and say, yeah, that's fine, and they continue, and some people put their credit card in and actually purchase. The number of people that come in the beginning and the number of people who go out the end is very different. And to assume that every purchase began as the same number of people that arrived, to get to 1,000 purchases, you only have to have 1,000 people arrive and 1,000 people put things in the cart. That's completely unrealistic. And we'll look at a graphic of that in a second. So you want to construct realistic funnels because when people put things in a cart, they use up resources. And if you're only calculating for the number of transactions, I need 1,000 transactions, and you're not also calculating for 10,000 shopping carts with abandoned items in them, you might not be modeling the right situation when you run your test. So the second bullet here, toggle third parties and feature sets on the fly with properties. So you may have a solution that has various components to it, and they don't all necessarily scale as well as each other. Major sites on busy days already have the ability to defeature themselves in areas they know they could get into trouble, right? And so in e-commerce, one of those areas would be when you're managing inventory, do you actually mark each item as consumed from inventory when it's ordered, or do you sort of square that up later? And if you've got a very large inventory and you don't expect to sell out of anything, it's way more efficient to actually not handle the inventory management in real time as people are placing orders, but to do it sort of by batch later. But you might try to have it on by normally and then maybe turn it off if the traffic gets too high and it's slowing you down, right? So that's an example of defeaturing a site on purpose. Another example would be if you're using a third party for something that's kind of interesting but not essential. Be wary of third parties. They may not really be able to handle as much load as you think. So being able to toggle them on and off, both in the real world in how your site functions, but also in how you run your tests. So whether your site has the ability to toggle them on and off, you may want the ability to toggle them off in your test. And there's two reasons for that. One is you may not have permission to test the third party with a load test. And so you may need to toggle them off at your larger load levels. And two, if they're the bottleneck in the middle of the test, you don't want to have to cancel the test. You want to just be able to kind of take them out of the loop. And I'll show you how we do that in a minute. The third one here, decorate headers so you can watch internals in APM. This is really sometimes it's referred to as red dye, which is you want to, the traffic you're sending through your load testing harness, you want to actually add headers to that you can watch on the back end using APM tools. So if I'm able to add a header to each request that says this is a load test, it's Bob's, Thursday 50% of scale test, and the step in here is add to cart, and the network emulation level is emulating a person on a Wi-Fi. If that's in the headers, then when you're looking at your APM in the back, you can actually very easily build dashboards that show you what is causing what and where you seeing things heat up. So we make that very easy. I'll show you how that in a minute. And then adjust your request per second in flight to see if the system recover. So we spoke about spike testing. One of the things you might want to do is you might want to bring up a large amount of engines, a large load capacity, but not drive it yet. Once they're all kind of up and running, you might ramp a little bit and get to sort of what you seem to be kind of normal level. And then when you're ready, you might dramatically increase the request per second to cause a spike, the equivalent of a spike where users are all arriving at once. Watch what your system does, and then bring the request per second back down again and watch to see if it recovers, right? And you can only do that if you can make kind of real-time changes in the test. You could consider using a plugin in the case of JMeter to pre-schedule this initial ramp and then a big spike and then a drop. And that's another option. We make it easy to do either, which is to do it live or to do it with a plugin. And the last one is if you use a content delivery network or a CDN, be sure to test it. And some of you will be familiar with CDN, some will not. We'll talk about what it is in just a minute, and I'll kind of explain what that's all about. But if you have a CDN, you may find that people will not want you to test it because CDNs aren't really fond of load tests. Excuse me. But the other thing is that CDN traffic is typically pay per traffic. So a really big load test is going to cost you something. So you want to be able to make sure you have time and budget to test that CDN if your real world scenario depends on using a CDN. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. So let's talk about realistic funnel, right? This is really me trying to provide a visual way for you to see what I was talking about here. On an e-commerce site, you might have a landing page, which may or may not be the home page. And then people are going to, and then it's sort of arriving, right? And if they're engaged by that landing page, they're going to either browse or search or choose something. If they are activated, meaning that they're, I think I want to buy something, they're going to put an item in the cart. And they're not truly converted until they actually put in their payment information and hit submit, right? And have a successful purchase. And in my example here, I'm showing that you might have 10,000 people arrive on your landing pages, and only 1,000 make it all the way through that funnel to do a purchase. And I worked on a project where a customer came to me and said, we just spent 6 months, and I'm not going to tell you how much money, but 6 months trying to figure out how to improve our solution over last year, and we've made no progress. We're not able to reconstruct the problems that we had in the real world, and I need you to do this. And they handed me a Excel spreadsheet that they had pulled from their analytics that showed exactly what you're looking at here. How many people went where, how many dropped off at each level, how many made it all the way to the end. And they said, if your test can't do all these things, I'm not going to pay you. Which was actually exactly what they should have said to the first person that they paid to do the consulting, which was they had literally spent 6 months where the developer who wrote the tests put 1,000 people through to get 1,000 orders, and every single user proceeded to every next step and did everything you'd expect, and nobody abandoned. And the system never fell over because they weren't tying up all the resources with the shopping carts full of products and the coupon codes that were being claimed but not checked out, et cetera, right? So you've got to construct a realistic funnel. If you took one thing away from this webinar, here it is, right? If you're going to create a large test, make sure you're actually doing what users do. So in the JMeter world, there are a number of ways you can create a funnel like this. I'm going to show you a really straightforward one. It's using something called the throughput controller. And the throughput controller has this throughput field that I've circled in red there. That says that when you get to this controller, allow that percentage of the threads that pass through to do the thing that's contained within that's nested under here, right? So this 90% continue has a search for item under it, and then there's another funnel that says 60% continue, and they put an item in the cart, and there's another funnel that says 35% continue, and they check out, right? And so this means that as you send, say, 100 users through this test, 9 out of 10 are going to come down here, and then 60% of those that are left are going to come down here, and then 35% of those are left, et cetera, right? And I'll bring this to life in just a second with an animation. But this is a very simple way to nest your test in a way that you actually model a funnel. So let's actually run a quick scenario here where I'm going to run 100 users through, and we'll see what happens, right? So, all right, now we've got 100 users that hit the home page, right? So 100 users made it to the home page, 9 out of 10 of them did a search. Of those, 60% put an item in the cart. Of those, 20% checked out. And so you can see that to only 11 purchases happened, right? So somebody says, oh, we need to be able to handle, 11,000 purchases per hour. Well, you're going to put in a lot of users to get there, right? So hopefully this kind of brings it to life for you. You need to model the actual funnel, and it's going to take a lot more traffic than you think if you're starting from the n number of orders. So the second tip was to be able to toggle third parties or entire feature sets on the fly by using an if controller and a property. So one of the features of BlazeMeter is the ability to change JMeter properties mid-test, right? Not only use these properties to configure how each run works, but you can actually change them on the fly while the test is running, right? And so in this case, this is a super simplified way I built this, but imagine you've got if controllers where you need them that are looking at an equation. In this case, I'm saying, I'm looking for the value of a property called third. I'm going to set the default value to be no. If this property is set to yes, then I'm going to go ahead and do the things contained within this controller, right? And so what happens here is I might launch the test with presetting the value to yes using the BlazeMeter UI. And then if I want to take the third parties out, I would just change that, frankly, to anything other than yes. That stuff's not going to get executed, right? So as an example of how that looks, so I would set the JMeter properties here. I would add a row in there, and I would say I've got this property in my JMX called third, and I'm going to set it to yes. So when the test launches, it's already going to be yes, right? Then when I'm running the test, I can use the remote control feature. And what I do is I bring up the remote control feature, and it'll show me that currently the value is yes on the engines, right? And I'll type in no, and I'll hit send, right? And when I do that, what'll happen is that changed value will be sent to all the engines in the test, and it could take upwards of a minute, probably a little less, but about a minute to get to all those engines, and suddenly they'll all start behaving differently, right? And so you'd immediately see the differences in your graphs and in your statistics. That's how we do kind of remote control on the fly. And by the way, there could be many rows here, right? So you could have one row for every major feature. If you know you have different sort of silos of functionality in your app and they all kind of behave differently, you could defeature your app just to see, if you've negotiated a test window and you've got 3 hours to test, you may have melted down one part of your solution. You may want to just defeature that part and keep the test going so you can figure out where the rest of the solution runs into issues. So let's talk about decorating headers to leverage APM, right? And the idea here is that I may want to, in the case I might be using CA APM, or I'm using New Relic or Dynatrace. When you decorate headers, we behind the scenes will give you the information that's in the test name, and the labels in your JMeter JMX, and we'll use those to create metadata that we send along with all your requests, so that when the APM is watching, it sees it coming and knows what's happening, right? Here's CA, here's Dynatrace. With Dynatrace, I'll show you an example. Actually, let's say you're using Dynatrace. They have built-in dashboards. All these tools, they'll give you the ability to build custom dashboards to show things. Here you have an example of a test. It's called APM Community, and it's got these steps. In their world, they call them timer name, but these are the steps in the test, right? I'm landing page, logging out, logging in, whatever, and they are keeping failure statistics, count statistics, and the average time in milliseconds. But down here is where it gets interesting. So you choose one of those transactions, and you can see how much traffic is coming into that particular transaction, and then you can visualize which, this is sort of 3 tiers deep, right? There's a web server, there's an app server here, and there's a database, right? And at a glance, you can tell that, well, it's not the database. The database is not melting down. It's happy, it's green. There is some issues here on this Confluence server, and as well as on the web server, right? So this lets you get a sense of where you would look to, you need to change the resources, you need to tune these systems. So be able to watch it from the back, because when you watch it from the front, you know the symptoms, you know that it's slower or you're getting errors, but you want to also know, well, what can I do about it? What's the real problem in the back? And that's where APMs come in, right? So I forgot there were pop-ups here. So yeah, here we're analyzing by name. Here we have the tiers showing up, and we might ask ourselves just the database, right? So the next tip I offered, which was the notion of especially in the context of a spike test, how do I adjust the request per second and check for recovery? And if you look at this test, we ramped up the load in a fairly regular pattern, but notice we kind of ran into some issues here. What I did was that after I ran into these issues with the response time here, I lowered the request per second on purpose, and to see whether the response time came back, and it did, right? And the errors went away as well. There were no errors over here, right? So that's an example of doing that. Let's talk about content delivery network. So super brief tutorial on content delivery network. If you haven't heard of it before, on the left is kind of, if you aren't using a content delivery network, users all over the world are coming to your infrastructure in the middle. And in the world of the CDN, this is called the origin server, right? So that's the part that you control. That's where your app lives. That's where your data lives. When you use a CDN, you surround your origin with edge servers that are provided to you by the CDN. And the goal is that many of the requests that would normally go all the way to here can be served by the edge, right? Now, something like creating a new account is going to go all the way to the middle. It's going to go to the origin server. But something like showing an image on a product detail page absolutely should be coming from the CDN, right? And the reason why you want to test the CDN if you're using it is that your scalability is based on knowing, and I'm putting knowing in quotes, knowing that some huge percentage of your traffic is going to get offloaded by the CDN for you. That all those images are going to get served from out here, and all the boilerplate text and many things are going to get served from the outside here. And when you want to actually be able to confirm with testing that happens, and you also want to be clear, so when real users come from all over the world, and that's another reason why it's great to have cloud testing instead of something that's just coming from inside your firewall. When you deliver users from the geographies that you're expecting, how does it behave? Now, one of the keys with CDN is that you obviously, if you're testing from all over the world, you don't want to deliver all the load from one place. That would not only would that be a not very valid test, but it'll make your CDN very cranky, because you'll probably melt down their point of presence in one geography with too much traffic, and you'll hurt all their customers. So we'll talk about out how we do a valid CDN test. But first we want to just talk about what is a CDN and why should you test it. So let's jump over to the demo, and let me pop over to this other screen here. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was the notion of running sandbox testing, or doing sort of a low scale test before you let's go back here. Right. So I ran a test where I wanted to make sure that my script was working as I expected and that everything was fine and I wasn't getting any errors at a low level. And you'll notice that sure enough, I got a lot of errors. And like, what's going on here? So really, once this test first launched, I knew I had trouble. And pop over to the errors tab. And if I take a look here, I can see that I have errors under book a flight and errors under reservation. Book a flight is actually a transaction. If I look at that, I can see that it says number of samples in transaction 3, number of failing samples 1. That's interesting. So let's look down in reservation, which is a step in that transaction. And sure enough, we can see that these guys are all failing. And the reason they failed is I deliberately broke this. I changed this URL to make it invalid. It should say reserve.php, and I broke it on purpose just to give an example of something that's not quite right. And I want to find that at super low volume before I get 100 people on a WebEx or a Zoom session and have them all staring at their screens. I don't want to be doing this kind of stuff, in the middle of the night when I'm doing a test. You do this kind of sandbox stuff ahead of time, right? And then as we build up to bigger tests, we're going to want to make our tests, we want to get some serious scale, right? And when I gave this presentation last year, I didn't have the feature I'm going to show you now, which is second here. Let me see where I want to go back and actually. Let's actually just create a new one. So we have a new way of doing things where if you just need to create geographic diversity, so I'll just grab this guy. Whoops, wrong one, sorry. Okay, and I want to right. Okay, so let's say I'm going to run a test with 20,000 users. Right? And I'm going to run it for 90 minutes. I'm going to ramp over the initial 60 minutes of the test. And I actually want to go through specific load levels while I do. So I'm going to actually say that I want 10 different load levels. So it's going to work its way up gradually and stay at each level for a little bit. Now here's what's different this year, which is that last year you would have had to do something we call a multi-test, which is sort of create separate tests and add them together to create geographic diversity. Now I literally can just click to add diversity here, right? So now I've got load coming from all these different locations, and if I remove locations, it's all going to be evenly weighted. If I want to make the weighting uneven, I could put 20% here and 10% here, and I could tweak these numbers until I'm happy. If I want to be lazy, I could just add another location and we'll fix it for you, right? Okay, so you get the idea that now I've got a diverse load. And actually, this is a big chunk of what a CDN would want. In the case of CDN testing, they want 9 locations. And I'm going to show you something we call a CDN test, which is that if I have this test here, which is already a really large test, it's going to create 90,000 users. We have a feature which, again, you might have to have this toggled on, have to ask us. It's not going to be in a free account, but if you're in a paid account, you can ask us to turn this on. CDN test will actually take this and create a configuration that would make a CDN happy. The biggest CDN is Akamai, and they have sort of a recipe of what they want in order to be happy, and that's a minimum of 9 different geographic locations. You'll also notice that the ramp up can be no less than 900 seconds. So they want the ramp to be gradual, and you could tweak these individual settings, but you get the idea here. This is how in the past people would achieve geographic diversity, but you saw how in the new way we do things with what we call new test create, it's just as easy as adding the locations here. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and we basically make those even. So I'll just make this a weird number so it, boom. Okay, right. So now I've got 9 locations, and I'm good to go. So the idea here is, start small, build them up, and then use the right shape of your test and then right amount of geographic diversity depending on where your users are going to come from in order to achieve your goals. So let's jump back into the deck because I know we're getting close to the end of our time. I wanted to share 2 success stories. We all work in different size companies. Some of you may work in a very large company. Some of you may work in a really small startup, or you're in a consulting firm that helps small and mid-sized companies. It's not just the giant e-commerce providers that do these tests. This is an example of a kind of a modest-sized company that Stance makes custom socks. They have all sorts of interesting artistic socks, and they had a chance to do a really, really big day because Rihanna, the pop star, agreed to do a joint deal with them where she was going to create, they're going to create custom socks for her, and she was going to announce it to her 80 million followers. This is a site that typically would see 500 users at a time in sort of their peak. And they knew they had an opportunity here and they didn't want to fall over and leave their normal customers sort of hurting and miss out on this opportunity. So they moved from their captive data center to an AWS configuration, and they came to us because they wanted to get a sense of how big they needed to be and then run through a series of tests to get big enough to handle. And they tested for 10 times their previous record of traffic. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened when Rihanna announced that these socks were available. The site got hit hard and stayed busy for a full 24 hours, and they sold the entire inventory in 24 hours. But it's a great success story because they spent the time, the discipline to get ready, and they were able to capture every last dime of the opportunity. They sold every sock. And nobody went away with error messages, right? And the technology director there, Andrew, I love what he put here because people think this is sort of rocket science or really tough, right? He says, if you're not doing load testing, do load testing. It's not as hard or as difficult as you might think, and BlazeMeter is so easy to spin up that you can load test in 5 minutes. So that was a cool story. The other one I wanted to share, again, not a giant company, a significant player in their space, but we're not talking about a huge company here, right? Movietickets.com saw what happened when The Force Awakens was first announced and tickets went on pre-sale. The sites were, everybody's sites basically went down. It probably kind of broke the internet. And they knew that there would be another wave when the movie actually opened and people who didn't want to pre-purchase wanted to just get tickets for a showing, right? And so they also did a move to Amazon from a hosted configuration, and they had 2 months to get ready. And they were very disciplined about this. They basically built up to a test configuration they're happy with, ran it at 30,000 users, and kept going and kept adding infrastructure until they got all the way to 300,000 concurrent users. So 300,000 people ordering tickets all at the same time. And when the big day came, they were able to service all those spikes successfully. So they captured all that revenue, didn't hurt their reputation, just exactly what you want to have happen, right? And again, we had a great quote from Craig Lefowitz there. People have really high expectations. Performance is everything. If you can't serve the pages quickly, their customers will go somewhere else. Especially in a business like movie tickets, where they're literally an overlay. They're not the theater company. They're a company that sells tickets for all sorts of theaters, right? And so that was a really cool story. The last thing I want to touch base on before we move to questions is if you're, obviously we want to help you get ready for Black Friday this year, but if you're trying to figure out how do I do this better? How do I work smarter? How do I actually have less drama at the end of my project? How do I build performance into everything we do? You want to look at the notion of sort of continuous testing and doing testing as part of your continuous integration process. And we have a tool which we contribute to the open source called Taurus, which is available at gettaurus.org, which lets you define your tests using source code friendly configuration files and to run your tests over and over and over and over again as part of development, not as something you do as pre-deployment, but literally you start as early as you're building anything. So as soon as you have something you can test, you start testing it, and you build baselines, and you every time you make changes, you change the tests. So you don't want to have a backlog between changing the product and updating the tests. If you're actually building a test as part of development, you always have a working test, right? And it's okay to actually run tests in a development environment and in a staging environment, an integration environment that isn't as big as production, because you're looking for relative change, right? Like when you built it last week, 100 users going through had an average response time of 1,500 milliseconds for a transaction, and you just did another build, and suddenly you're at 4 seconds, 4,000 milliseconds, right? And clearly you broke something, right? Example I heard yesterday was that somebody had literally changed a database query into an outer join kind of halfway by accident, and outer join causes a massive amount of database activity, and so they went from a very quick transaction to one that actually brought a production system down. And they would have found that if they'd been running tests sort of shifting left earlier in the process, right? So I know that's a lot of content, but I did want to save at least a few minutes for questions. So I'm gonna jump over to my dashboard really quick here and take a look at the questions. Give me 1 second. And if you haven't already asked a question, please go ahead and put one in there. And we'll Jason, you're still available? Yes. Jason, are you still
yes, I'm here
with us? Awesome.
I'm here.
So you still see the questions slide, but not my control panel. Is that correct?
Correct.
Awesome. Okay. Just want to respect anyone's privacy in case they're giving me anything sensitive in their question. Okay. So first question: which APM tool is suitable for all times? That's a great question. Not sure there's a good answer to that. APM tools, the main selection criteria there would be A, does the organization already have an APM tool? And then that's certainly on your short list. If you don't, then you need to look for suitability in terms of what kind of an app and infrastructure you're running, and what kind of a budget you have, and what kind of a time frame you have. There ironically are sometimes places where you can actually get a temporary license, but you're probably going to want to figure out which one you're going to use. We integrate with New Relic, AppDynamics, CAAPM, CloudWatch, and the Dynatrace, and they all have their sort of different pros and cons. I think it's more a matter of which ones do you have access to, and do some evaluation and see which ones seem to make sense to you. And I would actually try to use them or work on a proof of concept rather than just merely going by slide decks. A few people asked about the recordings, which absolutely. What metrics do you use in the calibrate stage to determine if your load engines? Great question. And actually someone caught something I left out of my demo, which is that, let's go back to, whoops, I don't want that. I can't, hang on a second, folks. Excuse me. I can't seem to get there we go. All right, so when you are calibrating, we actually have a help topic. So if you jump into BlazeMeter, if you don't already have an account, just get yourself a free account and come in here and launch this help bar on the side, and then calibration will show you. The key things when you're calibrating is you're really looking at CPU and memory are the big ones, right? So if I scroll down here, I'll have an example of a graph. So here I have a configuration where the memory was at like 8.9%, CPU was at 4.1. This system is practically taking a nap down here. Over here, I have the memory at 93%, and the CPU is basically pegged at 99.9. This system at the bottom is not delivering meaningful test data, right? In this configuration, you can't trust any of the numbers or the errors you're getting because your test itself is maxed out. So you don't need to be this calm, but you basically want to keep your metrics, and we give you some specifics in here. You generally want to keep stuff, below 75, 80% or whatever on these different metrics. There are some more advanced things. The connection count could impact things. So if you look and you have like a really high connection count per engine, your script may be very, very connection intensive, and you may want to spread that load out. So that's a great questions. Let's see, what else do we have? And I know we're almost out of time. I apologize, people. If we don't get to your question, definitely take a quick, I would basically re-mention it in the post-test survey, or let us ask us to get in touch with you. So, how can I check CPU utilization and memory using BlazeMeter? So out of the box, BlazeMeter is going to show CPU and memory on the test harness on our systems, not on yours. If you want to see the utilization of your systems, you would use an APM tool. So you'd use, Dynatrace, CAPM, etc. New Relic had a free version of the system monitoring, which they have end of lifed. I would recommend that you look into a free trial with CAPM to get those metrics if you don't have a tool. That would be my recommendation there. So I currently have very simple JMeter scripts that have people hit login button to add to cart. Yeah, so if your client says, my site will have 200,000 people on it during Black Friday, ask them more questions. Ask them how many people arrive, ask them how many people check out, and ask them if they have metrics for the other steps in the funnel. So you saw me model that in my very simple JMeter script. You want to actually ask your client some follow-up questions. And if they've got analytics, you could go up to their site and sort of play with a little bit and give a sense of where these fall-offs would be, but ask them if they have a funnel and that they know how many users proceed from one step to the next so that you can derive how many should arrive and how many should make it to the very end, right? And where should they drop off? Let's see. Are there any syntax checks being done for the JMeter test when I submit them or upload them? We have actually started adding validation. We look for sort of the obvious stuff. Are you missing, you're referring to a file that's actually not there. I'm not sure exactly how far along we are. Our intention is to catch all the things that could cause your test to stall. We're probably not going to rate you on how good your test is and whether you've written a really well-formed JMeter test. Certainly, if you've corrupted the file, we'll know that. So Jonathan, probably have to follow up on that for what sort of stuff you're looking for, and whether you have some specific examples of stuff you want to address that you think are frustrations you want to address. We'd love to know. Why funnel down to the desired number? If you need your example, wouldn't you need to be prepared for all 10,000 users to go through the checkout? Well, that's an interesting question. That's actually not how the real world works. I'm not saying that you should arbitrarily have fewer people check out than show up. I'm saying you better figure out what the typical example is if the system's been used before or in a like system, because it's never everybody shows up, buy something. Never, ever. No matter what you're selling. And even if you're selling the best tickets to the best concert, some people are going to get cold feet and say, wow, $500 a seat. No, I'm not going to buy. Right. So you need to accurately model, because if you have a 1-to-1 ratio of arrivals to purchase, you're not modeling what's going to happen on the busy day. And so you're not taking care of having a larger number of resources associated with dead transactions than with finished ones. And those dead transactions might be the thing that brings the system down if it's tying up memory or database capacity, right? If you have components on different servers, is it possible to check performance on each component? Different servers like a Kong server, Kafka, DB server, and what is the performance on each server? Yeah, that is an APM question. So Prema, we're going to see the symptoms. If you had the ability to hit endpoints directly on those different systems, you could watch the symptoms on our side. But in terms of how each of those components are performing on the back end, multiple hops back from a web server, you need to watch them using whatever built-in consoles they have, or an APM solution if you want to overlay their metrics into the same graphs for load testing. If everything's deployed on the cloud and is auto-scalable, then why do we have to worry? Well, it'll only be taken care of by infrastructure. I would love to believe that's true, but it's not. So nothing is perfectly scalable. First of all, you have to know what you're going to scale. And you might say, oh, well, if I'm using serverless technology, then it's up to Amazon, for instance, and Lambda functions to just keep going. Well, actually, you have settings for how much capacity you want to be able to tie up that you have to tell them. And even then, architecturally, your system has all sorts of interdependencies you don't know about until you stress it, right? And so you need to actually take it up to stress levels and actually see where it slows down. You may need to add a different ratio of resources. You may have a different approach to something. It's not as simple as sort of, it's just auto-scalable and it works great. So I appreciate the question, because I hope I've given you enough information to not want to find out the hard way. It's not all automatic, right? And nobody has a perfectly scalable solution that just magically scales. Now, you may be small enough that the built-in features of some solution may be adequate, but if you're really talking about pushing something hard, I'm pretty confident that it will not scale the first time the way you think it will. How do you go to load configuration page? I previously used the multi-test feature. Okay, so multi-test still exists. So the demo I did where I showed new test create, when you're if you don't have this in your account where it says JMeter test new, just shoot us a message and we'll add it. This is the beta of what we call new test create, which is that screen where I was able to add the multiple locations in one place. We still do have multi-test. So if you wanted to combine existing tests, tests that you created with the interface you're used to, not the new test create, can be added to this multi-test. We're working on releasing a multi-test that works with new test create as well. It's very soon in the works, but it's probably a sprint or two away. Let's see, I think I got through all the questions. And yes, if you don't have that feature, just drop us a line. So please be in touch. We're over by 6 minutes. I hope you guys have found this useful. Please do leave detailed responses in the questionnaire at the end. Just take a minute, 30 seconds or a minute. Tell us what you liked. Tell us what you thought was missing. Tell us what was particularly helpful. And then you can also check a box if you want somebody to contact you with follow-up. And we appreciate your time. We hope you found this of value. The questionnaires help us make sure these things are useful for you. So please do take just 30 seconds or so to fill it out, and have yourself a great day.